to 'Cause We're Nerds, the podcast that covers trends and new releases in comics, movies, video games, board games, and much more. I'm your host, Zach, and with me is my co-host and my cousin, Caleb.
Hey everyone.
Thanks for joining us on our current series, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, where we will be discussing each MCU movie in release order, all leading up to Marvel's Avengers-Infinity War coming out this May. So get ready to get hooked on a feeling as we dive into Guardians of the Galaxy. How did an obscure group of comic book superheroes become a box office hit? Was director James Gunn forced to include scenes of Thanos? And if so, why? And does this outer space adventure lay out a solid explanation for the Infinity Stones that will ultimately lead us to the Infinity War? So come and get your love as we answer these questions and much more on 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Guardians of the Galaxy. Caleb, I look at us doing this podcast, and you know what I see? Losers.
No, I thought we were the good guys.
We are the good guys. We're 12% of the good guys.
Well, that's better than 0, I guess.
So Caleb, we're now reviewing our 10th movie in the MCU with Guardians of the Galaxy, but the 18th movie, Black Panther, just came out last week, correct?
That's right. Well, 2 weeks ago, technically.
Shh. All right, so Caleb, we're obviously going to be doing a podcast. If you're listening to this, you're going to have to wait until about a week or two out of Infinity War to listen to what we thought of Black Panther and get all the Easter eggs and comic book references and everything else from that movie. But why don't you go ahead and give us your 10-second spoiler-free review of the Black Panther. Ready, set, go.
10 seconds. Okay. Yeah, it's pretty good.
It's decent.
What about you?
Yeah, I would say great movie, great action. Go check it out. 100% emoji, 2 thumbs up, crying laughing face. Done.
Awesome. All right. Now to the movie we're talking about today, Guardians.
Yeah, so how on earth did a kind of this obscure comic book, Guardians of the Galaxy, become a mainstream production? I mean, I just can't fathom Kevin Feige sitting down with all the executives of Disney and trying to pitch the fact that he is going to bring a strange cast of cosmic superheroes to the big screen.
Yeah, I know what you mean. This movie, though, I mean, it was in talks way back. It was first mentioned by Kevin Feige in 2010. I think he was at a Comic-Con convention. So this was something that they had been thinking about for a long time. And the reason why is because they wanted to do something different, you know? They had done a whole lot of space stuff that's very technology-based. They'd done Thor, which was kind of magical-based, but mostly steeped in a technological explanation for those things. And so they wanted to do something different than they had ever done before. And this was a space opera. And Kevin Feige liked the idea of it.
Okay, so Feige first publicly mentioned that it was an idea in 2010. Do you know when production started on this idea and to turn it into a reality?
Well, they did announce at the 2012 Comic-Con that it was in active development, and that's when they confirmed the movie's roster, the characters that we were going to see. Because this team has changed a lot over the years, and there are different characters that had been on it, and so this was kind of the most recent version of the team at that time.
That is very true. Are you familiar with the backstory or the comic origins of this team?
I know some of them. Most of it was in research for this podcast because I wasn't familiar with the team when this came out.
So I was sort of familiar with it, but like yourself, I had to dive a little deep back into their comic origins to find out that the Guardians of the Galaxy were created by Arnold Drake, Roy Thomas, and our favorite, Stan Lee, in a Marvel Superheroes issue 18 that was published in 1969. So this first cast of heroes, and like the premise of it, is that there's an astronaut and he bands together with these other superheroes. So one of the heroes is Charlie 27, who is born on Jupiter and has like 11 times the muscle mass of a normal human.
Not 27?
No, not 27, which would make a lot more sense, though. Because then you got Martinez, who is born on Pluto and has crystals on his body. You get the kind of theme here, right? Born on different planets.
Yep.
We get Yondu, who's actually part of that original Guardians of the Galaxy roster. And then Major Vance Astra, who's just the astronaut and really doesn't have any special superpowers other than the fact that he's an astronaut.
Oh, he got gypped.
Now, that was their first appearance, but like after their first appearance, they didn't appear in any comics for 5 years until a short 11-issue run in Marvel Presents in 1976. And that added another superhero, Starhawk, who I believe was on another planet, right? Again, following that comic stream. And again, they jumped into random comics here and there, but basically fell into obscurity for over 2 decades, okay?
Wow.
Nobody really picked them up until they got their main title, Guardians of the Galaxy, which launched in June of 1990. And it kept that original cast, including the added Starhawk, and added 2 female members to the superhero team. So they added Nikki, who was born on Mercury, and who was genetically engineered, and another superhero, Alita, who is from another planet. And this ran 62 issues until it was canceled in 1994. So it's kind of obscure strain how this Guardians of the Galaxy comic run kind of came about starting in 1969 and ending in kind of the mid-1990s. However, it was relaunched recently, as you mentioned, Caleb. So it was relaunched in July of 2008 with a second volume by Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning. And it was after the comic run Annihilation and Annihilation Conquest. Are you familiar with either of those?
I have heard of them, and I have seen the covers, but I haven't read them.
And it was this Guardian of the Galaxy team that we basically get in the movie. And so it had Star-Lord, Rocket Raccoon, Gamora, Drax, Groot, Mantis, who we'll see in the next movie, Adam Warlock, and Quasar. And that was like this main team from 2008. I'm pretty sure this is what Marvel Studios must have really pulled on for this movie.
Yes, I know that there are a lot of things in this movie that specifically came from that run. And there are some things that did come from the originals, but most of that stuff comes in later in the sequel.
And this ran for about 25 issues until 2010, ending on the Thanos imperative. And then it was relaunched again in 2013. So, like you said, Caleb, a lot of what we get in the movie comes from that relaunch or volume 2 of Guardians of the Galaxy in 2008.
So that's not surprising because people don't know who these characters are. I don't know if you remember, Zach, but there was a lot of uncertainty about this film. I mean, Marvel had done several movies at this point. They had done The Avengers, which was great. They had revitalized themselves after the year 2013 with the follow-up, Winter Soldier. And so this was like, what are they doing? Nobody really knew what it was going to be. Do you remember any of that kind of uncertainty going into it?
There's a raccoon in space, a giant tree in space, and some other random green people. Yeah, of course, right? Nobody knew who these characters were. Now, were you familiar with this idea of going into the intergalactic side of the Marvel comic universe?
Not really. I had read the Infinity Gauntlet storyline at this point, which is very, very cosmic, but the characters that come in there kind of pop in and out without a lot of explanation of who they are, so I didn't get a real sense of the atmosphere around and what characters were doing and who they were, so I didn't have a good grasp on it, no.
Yeah, that was an older comic run. I mean, I'm familiar with this cosmic kind of team from a comic run in 2006 called Annihilation. And it was like a one-shot prologue, and then they had 4 mini 4-part issues with like the Silver Surfer, Super Skrull, Nova, and Ronan the Accuser actually got his own 4-part issue. And then it ended with a kind of main 6-part issue series that had a lot to do with Thanos, Star-Lord, the prison that we see in this movie, the Beyonder, the Krees, Skrulls, Nova, Quasar, all these entities. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, if you would ask somebody kind of what are the intergalactic space races or people, you might get a list that we see a lot in this movie. You'd get the Kree, you would get the Nova and Nova Corps that we see a lot, Nova Corps, excuse me. But there's also a ton that they didn't go into, such as the Skrulls, Galactus, the Beyonder, Adam Warlock. Unfortunately, some of that is because it was owned still by Fox.
That's right. We will actually see the Skrulls in a couple years, or it might be next year. Captain Marvel, they now said they're going to be in that film, but for this film, they decided to leave those out and simplify things a little bit.
So James Gunn was picked to direct Guardians of the Galaxy. How did he land this directing gig?
Well, he wasn't the only one in the running. There were a couple other people, most notably Peyton Reed, who went on to direct Ant-Man, and the duo Anna Boden and Ryan Fleck, who are the ones that are actually directing Captain Marvel. James Gunn, as you said, did win out. I think it was just his vision for this film. The films he had done previous to this, he had done a film called Slither, which was kind of like a horror comedy, and I believe he did a film called Super. I'm not 100% on that.
No, you're correct. Yep.
Yeah, that had Dwight from The Office in it, and Ellen Page, I believe. And that was sort of like a satirical superhero film. And James Gunn is just kind of quirky in general. And so I think that they liked that, and they wanted to bring that to this film. But specifically, it was his intense vision for this film. I don't know how many interviews you've seen, Zach. This guy knows what he wants. He knows what he's talking about. And I think just anyone that would come to them with that intense of an idea would probably get the role for anything.
Well, not only do we get James Gunn directing, but we get a rather large cast of stars that appear in this. So we have Chris Pratt as Peter Quill, Zoe Saldana as Gamora, Dave Bautista as Drax, Vin Diesel as Groot, Bradley Cooper as Rocket, Lee Pace as Ronan, Michael Rooker as Yondu. Is it Karen Gillan as Nebula?
Karen Gillan.
Butchered that. Yeah. I'm not even going to go ahead and pronounce Korath. We got John C. Reilly as Corpsman Day, Glenn Close as Nova Prime, Sean Gunn, the brother of James Gunn, as Kreglin and the Onset Rocket. And returning to Korath, he is played by...
Oh, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name.
Is it Demon Hansu?
That sounds good to me.
Hansu?
Yeah, something like that, I'm sure. But yeah, this movie has a lot of people in it. This is probably Marvel's biggest movie. Even the Avengers, which had a lot of people in it, it had like 6 main people. And this does as well, but there's just so many characters and it's introducing so many things. Did you know that there were a lot of people up for Peter Quill?
I did not know that, no.
So some of the names, there were a lot of them. Some of the most notable ones are Zachary Levi, who we talked about in Thor the Dark World, who took over as Fandral.
Yep.
Joseph Gordon-Levitt from Looper and a bunch of other stuff. Michael Rosenbaum from Smallville, who actually does pop up in the sequel, but you wouldn't know it. John Gallagher Jr., and Eddie Redmayne, who we know from Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. And also, actually, Lee Pace, who does end up playing Ronan, he was up for this as well. And I talked about in our Thor the Dark World episode, the one shot that they had on there, All Hail the King, how there was that actor in there that from a show I really liked, *Halt and Catch Fire*. Lee Pace is actually in that show as well. And he was also in The Hobbit, 2 of the Hobbit films. So there's a pretty big pool that they had for this. When Chris Pratt came in to audition, Gunn said, "No, this is not our guy." All he saw him as was the chubby guy from Parks and Rec.
That's right, yeah.
Which is a great show. But he didn't see him as this guy. But he said, you know what? 20 seconds into the actual audition, he knew it. He said right then and there, he was ready to give it to him, even if he wasn't going to lose weight. Because apparently he was around about 300 pounds when he came in to do this.
Wow.
Because he gained weight for a previous movie role, and he hadn't lost it yet.
So how about Drax? Because there we actually don't get a movie star. We get a pro wrestler, Dave Bautista, who was a WWE wrestler.
That's right. I'm pretty sure that before this movie came out, the only thing that he had done was Riddick, but I don't know if that filmed before this one. I think he was cast in this first, and he got an acting coach to work on it. But there were a couple people. Jason Momoa, famously from Game of Thrones, now playing Aquaman, was up for this, as well as Isaiah Mustafa, who's the Old Spice guy.
Oh, no.
Right? And the rest of the cast, they kind of filled in here and there. Chris Patton, Dave Bautista, as well as Zoe Saldana, Michael Rooker, Karen Gillan. They all signed on in 2013.
Now, another interesting casting choice was Bradley Cooper as Rocket Raccoon. Now, initially, this part was supposed to go to Nathan Fillion. I know that he had tried out and that James Gunn really wanted him to play Rocket Raccoon. You might know him in Firefly. But after he tried out, it apparently didn't necessarily work with his voice acting skills. And they had a lot of voice actors come in and try this part. But as James Gunn put, a lot of them sounded too cartoony, like they were voice acting for a animated series, until they had Bradley Cooper come on board and try it out, and they decided to go with him.
Wow, that's pretty cool. I know that both he and Vin Diesel were the last two cast members added to the film, which was like halfway through shooting, because, they don't need them there on set. They're going to go back and voice over after the fact. So that's really cool. So, Zach, I did just want to take a moment. We talked a little bit about the uncertainty of this film, and I wanted to mention the very first trailer that came out for this. Do you remember that first trailer?
If I remember it correctly, it was a humorous, lighthearted, amazing trailer that got me on board right away.
Oh, okay. Well, I wasn't. I saw it, and I was very skeptical. It debuted on one of the late-night talk shows. I forget which one specifically, but it's pretty much exactly what this film is. And James Gunn has said that they had another trailer that was in contention for being ran in that spot as the first trailer, and it kind of sold the movie as something different than what it was. And we see that a lot in Hollywood. I think it's getting a little bit better these days. But, they wanted it to be something that people would go see. So they cut together this trailer. It wasn't exactly what the movie was going to be. And props to Marvel, because they said, you know what? We're going to stick to our guns. We're going to show the trailer that actually shows what this movie is going to be. Now, me personally, I wasn't on board then, but it got a whole lot of other people on board.
Yeah, I mean, James Gunn did stick to his guns, but but I think what worked with it is that it showed that this was going to be a goofy movie, as in it's going to be humorous, it's going to be lighthearted. It's not going to follow Captain America or Iron Man or Thor or all the other previous MCU movies we have received. It is going to be something iconic. And I think part of that iconic comes from the soundtrack of the movie. Caleb, I love this soundtrack. I mean, you have Hooked on a Feeling, which was heavily used in the trailers. Come and Get Your Love, Cherry Bomb, Oh Child. And that's just to name a few of the 12 songs that are on this track. Do you know how James Gunn decided to pick these songs?
I don't actually.
So apparently, according to him, is that him and some other producers or technicians or whoever made a list of the most iconic songs from the 60s and 70s and then proceeded to narrow it down to only 12 songs. And that's kind of how they got the soundtrack for the movie, and they decided to include all those songs into the movie. Now, I believe one or two of them there, like Ain't No Mountain High, get cut due to deleted scenes. But other than that, the majority of those songs actually end up on the movie. And up to this point, there hasn't been like a soundtrack really tied into the movie. We talked about how Iron Man has tried to tie in AC/DC and a bit of Black Sabbath into its movie, and it did a little of that, and it did okay. Black Panther, I think, tried a little of that with Kendrick Lamar's album. Caleb, I have loved that album. Since it came out 2 weeks ago, I have listened to it nonstop. It is a phenomenal album. But I even think Black Panther could have done a better job tying it into the movie itself. Here, James Gunn did a fantastic job tying in the soundtrack into the movie. And I mean, he did it well enough where my mom went to see this movie. She hated the movie, but she's like, I actually enjoyed myself because of the music.
Yeah, that's not surprising. I mean, this soundtrack, I believe, went to #1 on the charts for a couple of weeks. It was a really big deal.
It even came out on cassette because people wanted that vintage kick.
Yeah, and I read that actually Walkman sales skyrocketed after this film because people wanted to go see them. I guess the kids that don't know what they are anymore were like, oh, let's go get some.
Exactly. So Caleb, with the backstory of this movie covered, are you ready to jump into it?
Yeah, let's do it. Brash space adventurer Peter Quill finds himself chased by relentless bounty hunters after he steals an ancient artifact covered by Ronin, a powerful Kree villain. To evade Ronin, Quill is forced into an uneasy truce with 4 disparate misfits: gun-toting Rocket Raccoon, tree-like humanoid Groot, enigmatic Gamora, and vengeance-driven Drax the Destroyer. But when he discovers the artifact's true power and the cosmic threat it poses, Quill must rally his ragtag group to save the universe.
So this movie starts on Earth, and it's 1988. And here we see a young Peter Quill unfortunately not reach out and grab his mom's hand as she dies before he runs off and gets quickly abducted by an alien ship. Now, are you familiar with Peter Quill or his mom, Meredith Quill, in the comics? I know you said you knew some, but not a lot.
Absolutely not. I had no knowledge of them.
So Peter Quill, Star-Lord, as we'll quickly later find out he's called, was created by Steve Englehart and Steve Gann, so the two Steves. And he first appeared in the Marvel Preview 4 and then later 11 in like 1975 and 76. And Caleb, you can kind of think his story and the comic as like Star Wars, because it's revealed in these two comics that his dad, Jason, who was the Emperor of Spartex, crash landed on Earth, had some fondue with his mom, Meredith, and then he went up and left. She was then later shot and killed because she basically saw aliens and they shot her. And after Peter saw his mom die, he then meets an alien called the Master of the Sun, who turns him into Star-Lord by giving him an elemental gun and teaches him to fly or equips him to fly. It's not really clear. How does that sound for a movie so far?
Like something out of a bad 70s sci-fi.
Yeah, what's interesting is after his appearance in the mid-70s, he didn't appear again until 2004. So he appeared in a run of Thanos, as well as that comic run I mentioned in Annihilation in 2006. But it wasn't until a couple years later that he played a key role in another comic run, Annihilation Conquest, and then he landed his leading role in the second volume of Guardians of the Galaxy. And then he also appears in a couple other like comic book Cosmo crossovers, such as War of Kings and the Thanos Imperative.
That seems like a lot of stuff that's going on.
Yeah, that's true. And later they changed his backstory a small bit when they relaunched Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 with the Marvel Now. They basically just streamlined it. It's basically all the same. But they include different aliens that we'll talk about a little later. It's a lot going on, but it's not really necessary. And I think they get some of that truth here in the movie.
So as he's being picked up by the aliens, I'm pretty sure it cuts to the title card and then brings us straight into the movie. It's 26 years later, which means this is 2014, Zach?
See, that's what I thought, right? I mean, if it, was 1988, 26 years later, 2014. So does that mean that all the MCU movies to date have been following the timeline they were produced and then created? Question mark.
Yeah, I think that's pretty safe to say. And actually, Kevin Feige has come out and said the same thing, that each movie, as it comes out, is kind of happening in real time. So, like, Iron Man happened in 2008. Avengers in-Universe happened in 2012. There's a few movies later on that don't do that. The sequel to this is one of them. It takes place 6 months after this film. So still in 2014, 2015 range. But yeah, up until now, the year they came out.
Now, Caleb, after we see James Gunn's dog make a cameo, Dr. Wesley Von Spears, which is the dog's name, he's the holographic dog that Peter Quill runs into. Yep, that the child kind of pets. Peter Quill goes into, this ancient temple and then like puts on the Walkman and then starts to dance, right? To this epic soundtrack we get. And I don't know if you can remember seeing this in the theaters, but I remember like that set the entire mood for the rest of the movie because people practically didn't stop laughing from that point to the credits rolling.
Yeah, and this is a pretty big shift because after he gets off his ship up until the time this music starts, I got a really big Raiders of the Lost Ark feeling from this. And then he does turn that on and it completely turns everything on its head. And I think that this is a great way to introduce the music to the audience in the film because it is such a big part of it. So why not do it right at the beginning?
And not only the music, which is the Red Bones Come and Get Your Love, but also the humor, right? Because then it's like we get a Ninja Turtle joke, there's a Star-Lord joke, and then even after this entire scene, we get the alien girl who's in the starship, right? That he's like, oh, I didn't even remember you were there. Which, side note, she's actually from the comics. Her name is Barit. Remember, he's like, oh, I can't remember. Honestly, I don't even remember your name. She's like, it's Barit. She actually appears in the Incredible Hulk 269. She is kind of like a companion to the Hulk. So that's kind of just an interesting little nugget of information for you.
She's also wearing the t-shirt that Peter was wearing when he was abducted.
I did not know that. Now that is interesting.
Yeah, right?
2 nuggets.
So, jumping back a little bit, when the music is playing and he's in that kind of tomb thing, there's a bunch of stuff that happens in here. One really cool Easter egg is that he's kind of dancing and he sees a skeleton, he puts his hand on it. This is an Easter egg for Beta Ray Bill.
No.
Yeah, it's so Beta Ray Bill in the comics is a character that's tied to Thor. He is kind of like, he's basically a human-looking person, except his head is like a horse's head, right? He's got this really long snout, and he's got his own magical hammer I think it's called Stormbreaker, and he dresses a lot like Thor. And so he's a really, really popular character. He's actually one of those cosmic ones that you were talking about a little bit earlier, Zach. And this is a skeleton that's made to look like him.
So in the MCU, Beta Ray Bill is dead?
Well, it's not specifically stated it's him, but he's hinted at in a few different movies. So I thought that was pretty cool. There's another Easter egg later on in a future movie, Thor Ragnarok, where his face is on the Grandmaster's Tower. But that's not the only connection that Thor Ragnarok has to this movie, because that planet in Thor Ragnarok is called Sakaar. And Zach, who are these people coming in?
The Sakaarans.
Yeah, so these are mercenary soldiers that come in, and they do look different than the people that we see in Thor Ragnarok. And that's because these are the native species to Sakaar.
And actually, they weren't the first species that James Gunn wanted to use. He was supposed to use the Badoon, who play a huge role in the Guardians of the Galaxy comic relaunch, because if you remember, I said they relaunched Star-Lord's origin and some other aliens kill his mom instead. Well, that's the alien race, the Badoon, who kills his mom. Unfortunately, Fox owns them because that alien race first appeared in Silver Surfer issue 2, who they also own because of the Fantastic Four.
That's right. And so kind of coming in after these guys, we get our first introduction to the Ravagers with Yondu and Kraglin on the planet.
Well, before the Ravagers actually come on board, we get Korath, or Korath the Pursuer, who is a Kree agent. I mean, in the comics, he's kind of here and there, and he has cyber kind of tech, but he plays a side villain in this movie.
Yeah, I actually looked him up because I wasn't sure what he was part of, if he was Kree, if he was a Sakaaran, because he doesn't look like either. And he's listed as a Kree on the Marvel Cinematic Universe wiki, but he's the only Kree in the entirety of the MCU that's not blue.
Well, and in the comics, he is blue, and he has extra, superpowers, so he really looks nothing like his comic book origin, and just kind of a very strange add-on, I thought.
I agree. And so Star-Lord escapes, and makes it to his ship, and he flies off, and the Ravagers are coming in behind him, because pretty much we find out that Peter has gone and stolen their stuff. They were supposed to get there first. But this is our first introduction to the Ravagers, Yondu and Kraglin. Now, Zach, you mentioned that Sean Gunn, James Gunn's brother, played Rocket on set. He also plays a character called Kraglin, who is one of the Ravagers. He's kind of the tall, skinny guy.
That's right. It's all about those family connections, Caleb.
Now, I didn't know him personally at this time, but my wife did because he was a pretty big character in the Gilmore Girls TV show that had been running for several years. Had you ever seen that?
Can I lie on a podcast?
Well, we're not going to.
I have seen it. I can't remember the character he does play, but I'm pretty sure it's kind of like in The Town Idiot.
Yes, it is. So that's pretty cool that he plays two different characters. The other thing I want to mention, Zach, Michael Rooker here. He plays Yondu. I knew him, I think, from pretty much only one movie at this point that I could remember, which was Mallrats, which is a Kevin Smith movie, an early one. I might have seen him in some other movies. Had you seen him at this point?
Yes, he was a huge character on The Walking Dead.
Oh, you're right. I completely forgot that had been out at this point. Yep. So yes, I knew him from that.
Yeah, he was Daryl's brother on The Walking Dead, and he had a huge story arc. He was a huge hero, then a huge villain. So yeah, I knew him from that.
Yeah, okay. So you know then that in these movies, he's kind of portrayed as like a dirty, kind of down-to-earth Southern type guy, right?
He's kind of portrayed as this... I'll bite. Sure.
Well, basically, the reason I'm saying this is I got to meet him at a Comic-Con in Nashville a few years ago. And this guy is crazy. Like...
Aren't most Southern people?
Hey now. I don't know how to explain to you the type of crazy he is. He is awesome crazy. He is funny crazy. But, like, there were lines of people, lined up to ask him questions, and someone would ask him a question. They'd been standing there for 30 minutes. Typically, like, people are nice about things. And he'd say, doesn't matter. And he'd push them aside and, like, go to the next person.
Oh, wow.
And they'd be like, oh, can I have a hug? And he'd be like, no, next. And he'd push him to the side. And not to say that he's mean, because he's not. He's actually a very, very nice guy. But he would just do crazy things like that. And the entire panel was insane. So, props to this actor, because this is not actually how he is in real life at all.
So in this movie, he plays Yondu, who I mentioned was one of the original members of the Guardians of the Galaxy in that 1969 issue. And he's pretty much the same, but not quite. in his as an original form, he's Alpha Centurion, so he's like all blue skinned, and he does have a bow and arrow. So instead of just like this whistling arrow, he actually is more of an archer with like a golden bow and arrow. So he shares some similarities, but he's not quite the same.
Moving on, we jump to a giant warship, and we get our introduction to Ronan.
Yeah, we actually get a lot of introductions here. It's here that we see Ronan. It's here we kind of see the Kree. And it's here that we also get introduced to a couple of daughters, as it's stated in the MCU, of Thanos, Nebula, and Gamora.
That's right. So in this movie, Ronan is like a religious zealot, right? He is following the ancient teachings of his people, the Kree, and he's upset because the Kree have recently signed a peace treaty with the Xandarians. Now, they talk about in this movie that the Kree and the Xandarians have been at war for thousands of years. Zach, in the comics, this is not a Kree-Xandar war. This is a Kree-Skrull war.
That's correct. It was a comic run in 1971 to 1972. The Kree have actually fought with a lot of people, but the Skrull are their main enemy.
And just because, Fox owned them, they weren't able to use them, so they kind of switched them out for this. And it made more sense in the story anyway.
Do you know why they didn't use I believe you pronounce it Shi'er? Because later on in the comics, they have another huge war between the Kree and the Shi'er.
I don't know exactly why they didn't use the Shi'er. I'm assuming that they were just trying to streamline it, and because the Xandarians were already in this film, it made more sense.
Now, what's interesting about Ronan is that, as you mentioned, Caleb, he's kind of this religious zealot. That's completely opposite of what he is in the comics. They state his full name in the movie because he is Ronan the Accuser. He's kind of this form of justice for the Kree. So he goes and he seeks justice. And in fact, I stated this early on that I read a lot of the Fantastic Four comics. That's when he first appeared. He was created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee in Fantastic Four issue 65. Now, I vaguely remember reading some of that. I know him more from the Annihilation run when he had his own 4-part series in that 2006 run. But Caleb, in that series, he is an incredibly powerful being. And I think to date, and in the release order in the MCU, he is probably the most powerful supervillain that we have encountered in one of these movies.
I think you're right, except for maybe Malekith when he has the stone.
Correct. As mentioned, we also see Nebula and Gamora. Were you familiar with these two?
So I was familiar with Nebula because she plays a fairly large part in the Infinity Gauntlet storyline.
Correct.
She's pretty different here. This is a character that was, I think, completely redesigned from the ground up for this film. I know at one point in the comics, she does have like a metal arm and a metal plate on her head. I think that was after this movie came out, though. I'm not 100% on that, though. Do you know, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, her origin story is very different. She appeared in one of the Avengers comics. It was Avenger 257, which was like in the mid-80s. She's a space pirate, so she actually, I believe, like wiped out Xandar at one point and the Nova Corps. She took over Sanctuary 2, which was Thanos' ship, his massive spaceship. And she, I think really the only thing they carry over from the comics is that she is a foster daughter of Thanos in the movie.
Well, in the comics, she's actually not a daughter. She is a supposed granddaughter of Thanos. And they do kind of take that and shift it here, make her just a daughter because it's cleaner.
Correct. And it's Gamora. Sorry, you're right. It's Gamora who's the foster daughter, and it's Nebula who's the alleged granddaughter.
Right. So you mentioned here we also get Gamora. What do we know about her from the comics?
You know, all I know from her is that she appeared in one of those obscure comics, Strange Tales number 180, in the 70s. Other than that, I don't know much of her. She did reappear in that volume 2 of Guardians of the Galaxy alongside Peter Quill and Rocket Raccoon and Groot and all of them. But other than that, I'm not sure she played a huge role.
Yeah, and I don't really know much about her either.
So we get the sense here that there's obviously some rivalry between the two. There's actually a deleted scene where they kind of fight in that spaceship that's deleted just because it's kind of useless. But it's after that we then go to Xandar to see that Peter Quill is trying to sell this item that he has. But before that, we run into two interesting creatures, and as Peter Quill calls them, Ranger Rick and the Giving Tree, which are actually both references to children's books.
Yeah, this is our first introduction to Rocket and Groot. And, I think it's a good introduction. It seems like they're bounty hunters here.
Yeah, that's what it seems. They're obviously using some type of device to find people worth, that have a hit on them, which is where we get our Stan Lee cameo. Is this the first Stan Lee cameo where he doesn't necessarily utter a word?
Well, he is talking, but we can't hear it as an audience member. I'm assuming they shot this with the intention to have him talk, and it just didn't work well, so they did that overlay on it. But, yeah, I think it is. Well, in Incredible Hulk, he had a very small line. True.
I will say that I think this is one of the best Stan Lee cameos. However, that's kind of given to what Rocket and Groot say. Well, what Rocket says about him in this scene.
Yeah, it's funny, but personally, this is actually on the lower list of Stan Lee cameos. Maybe someday we'll rank all the Stan Lee cameos like we're doing the Marvel movies.
That's right. That's right after the Infinity War. We're going to take 2 hours to do it. And so it's kind of interesting, actually. I think out of all the characters from like a comic standpoint and an origin standpoint, Rocket and Groot have the most interesting backgrounds to their stories. So Rocket Raccoon, do you know kind of the inspiration that was taken for his creation?
No, I don't.
It was taken from a Beatles song, I believe a 1968 Beatles song called Rocky Raccoon. And so he was created in the Marvel Preview 7 in 1976, and that's what he was initially called, Rocky Raccoon. And in this Beatles song, it's about a boy who kind of goes and tries to kill somebody else and gets killed himself, Rocky Raccoon. So anyways, they took that, they made him to a real raccoon, and then they, who I can't remember the artist who created him, and then he developed into Rocket Raccoon. So I thought that was kind of interesting. He was taken off a Beatles song.
Yeah.
Groot, on the other hand, so he was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, as well as Dick Ayers, in Tales to Astonish 13, which was in 1960. So he's probably the oldest created hero out of this whole cast. And when he was originally created, you can imagine like one of those monster tales. He's this huge, like massive tree that's, I don't know, like 8 cars wide and a couple stories tall, right? He's just this massive monster. But in the comics, he's later collected by the Collector, which is kind of hinted at this movie, and was basically changed from a menace into a guardian during the comic run of Annihilation Conquest. And to where he originally was actually able to talk because he was like from Planet X. And when they changed him, they decided he could only say, "I am Groot."
Interesting. Very cool. Now, I don't know about you, Zach, but on this viewing, I felt that their CGI here in their introduction was a little shaky.
Interesting, because in my notes, I have CGI looks incredible! Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. I actually thought their CGI looked fantastic, especially Rocket CGI.
Yeah, I think it looks a lot better later. I don't know what it is. I used to do some kind of homebrew CGI type work, and so maybe I'm just more tuned to seeing that kind of thing, but it didn't look as good here as it does later in the film, I thought.
Sure. Well, and it's here that we get a fight scene. So Gamora tries to apprehend Peter Quill just to grab that orb, and they all tussle, they all fight. I thought this was a really fun scene just to see all 4 of those characters interact, and all 4 of those characters getting captured by the Nova Corps.
During this fight scene, Zach, they run across a bridge that they show a couple times in the film. I wanted to mention this bridge is actually a very special bridge. It's called the Millennium Bridge. It's located in London. It goes over the River Thames, I believe. And it was built to commemorate the millennium, to the year 2000.
As well as the Guardians of the Galaxy in the year 2014.
So they are captured by the Nova Corps. And Zach, who are the Nova Corps? I mean, I know for me, they're kind of like the Green Lantern Corps in DC.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Think Green Lantern Corps, but Marvel. So again, this is another kind of space entity that appeared in the Fantastic Four comics. They had a cameo in Fantastic Four 204, but like really appeared in 205. So the idea of the Nova Corps are that they are a group of about 500 soldiers that use the Nova Force for good and kind of justice. So they're able to fly. They can shoot beams out of their hands. And it kind of varies from comics. Some comics, they only use Xandarians. On other comics I've seen, it's kind of a random makeup of aliens, basically copying the Green Lantern Corps. So it kind of varies there. And at different parts in the comics, they've also been wiped out. So like during Annihilation, they basically all died, but then they were all brought back, but then they all died again.
So that's the Annihilation in the title.
Yeah, exactly, right? I will say this, that one of the most prominent Nova Corps members is Richard Rider, who is the superhero known as Nova. So he is a Nova Centurion. So how kind of like the Nova Corps works there are 4 rankings that you can be. So not everybody has the same power level. You have different power levels depending on your ranking. So the lowest is a Corpsman. You have like basic power. Then the Millennium. Then the Denarian, I believe. And then the Centurion. And Nova, the superhero, is one of the last remaining Centurion Nova Corps members.
So we do get a couple of other Nova characters here. We get John C. Reilly as Corpsman Day, and Nova Prime, played by Glenn Close.
That's right. John C. Reilly, I thought, added to the humor. That was a great pick. I don't know Glenn Close, to be honest. I thought her acting was good.
I don't know her. I'm pretty sure she's a very well-respected, traditional kind of theater-style actor. Think Christopher Lee or someone of that stature, but I don't know her personally.
Now, I will say this. After the movie came out, people were speculating that we could possibly get a Nova movie. Kevin Feige has never said we would. James Gunn has said maybe in the future we would. But I would say at this point, I don't necessarily see one coming out in the next 5 years. However, with Captain Marvel, and we don't know what they're going to do with Phase 4, they could potentially go more into the cosmos, and we might see this in 8 years, 10 years.
Actually, Zach, I'm going to make a wild prediction. We will have a Nova Corps movie let's see, it's 2018 right now. We will have one by 2023. Yes, within 5 years. Because James Gunn has said he's not a fan of Nova, personally. But Phase 4 of the MCU is going to go more cosmic. James Gunn, which is some of the fallout of this film, is actually kind of leading that phase. He's leading the cosmic charge, if you will. And that's going to be a main focus in Phase 4 to try to differentiate it from the other 3 phases we've gotten and the entire build-up to Thanos. So I think that Nova actually will be a character we see, if not in his own movie, in another movie by 2023.
Well, after our heroes get captured, they are sent to a very secure prison. The Killian? It's it's Kyln.
Yeah, I think it's pronounced the Kiln.
Where we actually first are introduced to Peter Quill's body, because they obviously always have to have the superhero with the shirt off, right? And
Yep.
Man, he did get ripped for this role.
Yeah, he worked for, I think, 6 months and lost 50 or 60 pounds for this movie. And, look, he looks great.
We also get a interesting cameo by Nathan Fillion, who was kind of up to play the role of, or voice, Rocket Raccoon. You wouldn't notice, but he is the big blue monster.
Wait, the one with the headphones?
No. Not the one with the headphones. The one that Groot takes his roots and sticks it up the guy's nose.
Oh, okay, the CGI guy.
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, before we get too far here, I do want to talk about the Kiln, because it is in the comics, Zach. It's a little bit different. It's still a prison there, and is ran by a group called the Omega Corps, which is a different kind of peacekeeping group in the comics. But it also serves as a power generator, because it sits on the edge of this, weird space rift thing. I think it's called the Crunch. And the whole building is like these orbs that kind of look like a giant necklace or something. But this is something from the comics.
Correct, yes. We also get introduced here to Drax the Destroyer, who actually appeared in Iron Man 55. So that's like his first appearance.
This Drax is kind of different, but the same as his comics version. Do you know anything about that history?
I know a little bit about it. In this version, he's less green. In the comics, he's very green. That was more done because they didn't want too many green just people running around in this movie. I do know that in the comics, he was created by Jim Starlin, who is the same writer who created Thanos. So, he's known as... And what's interesting about this is that writer is actually known as the Grim Reaper in comics, because he wrote The Death of Captain Marvel in 1982, and then you're probably more familiar with this comic. He wrote also Batman, A Death in the Family.
Yes.
Where readers could vote to see if Jason Todd would live or die. And so, I didn't know that until I did some research that this guy also created Drax the Destroyer.
So Drax is kind of weird in the comics. He was originally a human named Arthur Douglas. And Thanos comes to Earth at some point to kind of survey the planet, and he's killed by Thanos. Now, Thanos has some really complicated family in the comics. It's kind of like the Greek gods, that sort of thing. Like, none of them look the same. They all can do different things. But Thanos' father, named Mentor, reanimated Arthur into Drax, and he filled him with hate for Thanos because Mentor didn't like what Thanos was doing at the time. Now, this Drax is very different from the one we have now. He is green, but he's got like this whole head, mask thing, helmet thing that doesn't cover his face, but it's like skin tight. He's got a cape. He looks kind of ridiculous. He was eventually separated from his body. His consciousness was, and his body kind of disappeared, and was brought back by Kronos, who is Mentor's father, which would make Kronos Thanos' grandfather.
Yep.
And so he brought Drax back and put him in a new body. And that's the Drax that we see in this film, kind of the muscle-bound guy with red tattoos all over him. So he is a little different in the comics. He does have that hate for Thanos. That's not in this movie. In this movie, it's a hate for Ronan. But by the end of it, he does have that hate for Thanos.
And continuing on that, I can't remember which comic it is. It might be the Thanos Imperative. But Drax actually kills Thanos in a really cool comic shot. He pierces his arm from behind Thanos' body and rips out his heart, his still beating heart.
Oh, wow.
And Thanos looks down and basically says, interesting. So, I am betting, there's probably a 5% bet, that in Avengers 4, Drax will be the one that will kill Thanos, and he will do it in that way.
Very cool, very cool.
Now, an interesting side bit about how Drax the Destroyer looks is that Dave Bautista had to sit for, I believe it was around 4 hours, or stand for 4 hours, while makeup artists applied all those scarring onto his skin, and he never complained.
Yeah, the actual amount of time varied depending on where it was in production, because they got better at it, so it became faster. But he could not sit, because it was all the way around him. I think 4 hours was the minimum they got it down to. But he's such a nice guy that I'm not surprised at all he never complained. I couldn't do it personally. Standing on my feet for 4 hours, then going out and doing a 12-hour shoot, I just couldn't do it. So before we move on from the prison, in the scene where Drax is kind of introduced and he's threatening Gamora, we have a couple Easter eggs. Peter Quill mentions while he's trying to save Gamora that he slept with a Rajak girl and also a Oscavarian. Now, these are actually races from the comic books. Rajak was a planet that was attacked in the comics by a character called Ultimo, which is kind of similar to Ultron, but massive. They don't have a whole lot to do, though. The Oscavarians, on the other hand, are a bit more fleshed out. These are kind of reptile-type creatures. They have, 3 or 4 kind of squid tentacles for arms, for each arm. Their teeth are like needles, and they have gills for a nose. So it's really funny if you imagine that talking to Peter Quill and what he's saying. It's like, ew.
Exactly. That was a really cool Easter egg they included in the movie.
So after that, though, we do jump to the Sanctuary. This is our first look at it, and this is where Thanos kind of resides.
And Caleb, it's here where I had mentioned in the Avengers that you get the feeling that the other is kind of extremely weak, right? Because he's lecturing Ronan on how to speak to Thanos, and Ronan will have none of it and kills the other like that.
And it's interesting you say that, because the entire reason that this happens was because James Gunn thought, oh, well, we know Thanos is powerful. We know the other is powerful because he kind of gave Loki the staff. And so if we let Ronan kill the other, it'll show how powerful he is. But you're right. I think it has the opposite effect, where it shows how weak the other is.
I was always interested why they chose to put Thanos in the movie, because I believe it undermines the main villain in this movie as Ronan. He doesn't get as much screen time, and he kind of falls into the typical MCU trope where he's just a villain out to destroy the universe just because that's what he does.
I actually really like Ronan in this movie. I feel like he is maybe middle of the road for Marvel villains. He's not great, but he does have motivation, which is more than you can say about some of the other ones. And Thanos was not actually mandated by Marvel to be in here. That is a common misconception. James Gunn actually wanted him to be in this movie. Kevin Feige pushed back originally, and James Gunn has said, you know what, no, I want him in the movie, mostly because he wanted the connection to the Avengers. It wasn't narratively. He said that he could have cut him, and it wouldn't have made any difference. But he did want to put it in there so people that saw the Avengers could say, oh, hey, look, that's the purple guy at the end. He is a real character.
And what I will say is that I feel here, when we see him, his design looks the best, kind of the best that we get, or that we've received so far, including what we have seen from the trailers to Infinity War. I love his design here better than what we have seen.
How so? Because, I mean, I think he looks pretty much the same.
No, for me, he looks bulkier. He's bigger, bulkier. I do like the helmet on him, and he looks more purple. In the trailers, what we have seen is that he looks less bulky, more humanoid. He just has a bald Simpson head, and he looks a little more pinkish, right?
Okay, well, real quick, to address the color, because I know this is a very common complaint out there, color changes by scene, right? I mean, you can take Scooby-Doo and put him in a dark room and he'll be blue, right? It's just the way you do color. But I think he will suit up in armor in that movie. We haven't seen it so far, but I've seen some Lego sets and things that suggest he does.
Well, and I would say my main complaint is the bulkiness. It might just be me, but for me, he seems bulkier and I guess more powerful when he's sitting on the throne versus the trailers where he's just standing.
Okay, well, I guess we'll see when that movie finally comes out. But, Zach, this was our first full introduction to Thanos, so it was a really, really cool fan moment to see him there on that throne. And that throne, as you kind of hinted at in the Avengers, is something that he does have in the comics.
That's right. But that glimpse of him and the throne is short-lived as we go back to the prison where the escape sequence happens. Caleb, this is a great sequence. It's super funny. Peter Quill goes and gets the prosthetic leg just because, right? I love...
And Zach, about that prosthetic leg, I came in with 2 good legs, and they took out my one good leg.
I will quit the podcast if that is your running joke.
Now you know how I feel.
I will say, though, out of all this humor, there's so much to love, but I've always had one issue with this scene.
Really? What is it?
So when they finally are in the control room of the prison and Rocket's trying to get his device so that the anti-grav fails, 4 guys rush in, right? And they all have rocket launchers. And instead of firing all at once, they fire one at a time, right? So it's 1, 2, 3. And then when it will only take one more rocket to shatter the glass, he then has all of them fire at once. So why didn't he start with that? Yeah. Or if he was going with something more of a slow buildup, then have the guys rush in one at a time or, do something different. I never got that.
Yeah. And actually watching it this time, I noticed that they fire and then the very last one, he does a countdown and it's like, well, you could have just had them fire the same way they just did 3 or 4 times. I will give you that. It doesn't make sense. It's there for tension to make us kind of worry that they're not going to make it out, but we know they're going to.
Now, it's after here that we kind of jump around a little bit. First, we get the heroes in the Milano. We get Ronan and Nebula, who are at the prison trying to track them down. And then we get Yondu and Kraglin, who are in Xandar trying to track them down. So 2 enemies trying to hunt them down, with the heroes ending up in nowhere, which is actually the ancient head of a celestial being.
Now, Zach, they talk a little bit about the Celestials here in this movie. Why don't you tell us a bit about them in the comics?
Yeah, so in the comics, the Celestials are some of the oldest entities kind of known in the Marvel comic universe. As far as just creation goes, they were actually just created by Jack Kirby in a comic run titled The Internals, and that was not too late. That was only in 1976. But as far as just in the universe itself, their background is still not known. So it's been alluded to different backgrounds depending on different comics, but nobody has ever come out and stated this is exactly what it is. So it's still unknown. All we do know is that they're incredibly powerful and they're one of the earliest known beings. And we do know some of their names. For example, when we finally get to see the Collector, he shows them a video of one of the celestial beings. Well, that is, I believe it's Eson, E-S-O-N, the Searcher. And he comes in the comic books in the Internals number 9. As another tidbit, have you ever played Lego Marvel Superheroes?
Why, of course.
Have you played the second one?
Oh, no.
Okay, because in the second one, he's actually the first level end boss that you face. He's Eson, the Searcher, the Celestial.
That's really, really cool. I've been meaning to play. I've got to pick that up. But we do eventually make our way into the Collector's collection. And we did see this guy at the end of Thor: The Dark World. And so this isn't our first introduction to him, but this is where we find out who he is, right? And he's this guy that goes around and collects stuff. What's important here for our podcast is all of the Easter eggs. Zach, I mentioned this in an earlier episode. This thing is a treasure trove of Easter eggs.
So many. My favorite has to be Cosmo the Space Dog. He is a newer character in the comics. He appeared in Nova 8 in 2008, but even though he's newer, he has a classic comic book storyline. He was a Russian space dog who was launched into space. He drifted off for a bit. He mutated, gained telepathic abilities, and later became the head of a random security force at a space station. Just the most random storyline ever, from point A to point B.
And he actually does become a Guardian in the comics as well, so it ties in directly with his movie.
Now, Caleb, what are the other Easter eggs we get?
So there are a ton of races and creatures from the rest of the movies that are in here. There's a dark elf in here. There's a Chitauri alien. There's a frost giant. I mentioned one of the other movies that James Gunn had done was Slither, which has these like slug type things. Those are in here. And also, if you look very up into the top, Howard the Duck is sitting in here. You can see him during the movie.
That's awesome.
Now, there's a pretty big one in here, too, that people were like, oh, we know what that is. To my knowledge, it was never confirmed. I saw some posts online that said James Gunn previously confirmed it and then went back on it. I don't think that's the case. It could be. I didn't find anything to suggest that. But what I'm talking about is Adam Warlock's cocoon.
Yes, a cocoon that in the comics he kind of comes out of, which, again, is another Fantastic Four individual who appears in the Fantastic Four comics in FF66. Caleb, I saw that too, that James Gunn somewhat confirmed. Again, I don't know how believable that is, but we will get Adam Warlock, I believe, in Guardians of the Galaxy V3.
Yes, James Gunn has said that. It's not confirmed. That was several months ago, of course, when he said that, but I would put my money on it.
Now, not only do we get an explanation of the Celestials and a ton of Easter eggs, but we finally get a roadwork and an explanation of the Infinity Stones, what they are, and how many of them they are.
Yes, and this is actually the first time they're called the Infinity Stones in the movies. In the comics, these are known as the Infinity Gems, because they're like, precious gems type things. In the movies, they are called the Stones instead. Small difference. But it is the collector who explains that they existed before the universe, that they were the 6 singularities that were concentrated into these powerful ingots, and that they are immensely powerful. And it's here that we also learn that the orb that they've been carrying around this whole time is a containment vessel for one of the stones.
Yeah, that's right. So the stones that are listed, that containment vessel for the stone they're carrying around is for the Power Stone, which is purple. The other stones, we have a Mind Stone, which is yellow, a Reality Stone, which is red, a Time Stone, which is green, and a Soul Stone, which is orange. I always thought the most interesting aspect was the Mind Stone because its color is yellow, yet currently it's in Loki's staff, which is like blue, like glowing blue. So I'm not really sure if that was a retcon or if it was just projecting some blue light.
Yeah, I don't think they had planned to make the scepter an Infinity Stone when Avengers came out, so I think that was some retconning going on there. But each of these things, the Tesseract, they're containment, right? So the goal is to keep the energy in. So it kind of makes sense that the color wouldn't show through. Now, Zach, these colors that you're talking about, are these the colors used in the movies?
These are the colors in the movies. It is completely different in the comics. So the stones actually have different colors in the comics.
And they've actually changed a couple times in the comics from what I've read. Sometimes there are certain colors, sometimes they're not. I think over the past 10 years or so, they've started to become more consistent.
Well, Caleb, before we leave the collector, Tennelly or Tavan, I would like to note another line that has always bugged me about the movie. It bugged me when I saw this movie. It continues to bug me. And that is, before the heroes go in to meet the collector, we get Gamora and Peter talking. And Peter's talking about how everybody has sticks up their butts. And we have a hero, Kevin Bacon, who took them out and they're dancing, right? And it's here Gamora states, "Who put the sticks up their butts?" This is not a Gamora line. That is a Drax line. Up until this movie, Gamora has shown that she is very intelligent, gets Star-Lord's humor, and it's Drax who takes everything literal. I have never liked that line. I thought that was a terrible line for Gamora to talk about. I'm sorry, but I just needed to vent.
And that's funny because I noticed that more this time, and I thought that was really, really funny. Because, I mean, you know, she gets the slang, but some things she's just not gonna get, so I'm fine with it.
We haven't mentioned it up to this point yet, Caleb, but this movie portrays the relationship between Gamora and Peter Quill really well. I think it's a strong relationship, right? Because they're never together, but there's something there. And, you know, there's humor, there's potentially some romance, but it always gets broken up. And I think they do a fantastic job with it. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I think that as a couple, they're good. I think Gamora herself, she's not exactly like she's in the comics. I think she's more of a warrior in the comics, but them together, I do think it's good. Something to note, this is the only MCU film up until the point it was released that does not feature a kiss. They were about to kiss in this scene. It never happens, and there's no kiss in the rest of the movie.
Doesn't Rocket Raccoon kiss Groot? Like his little twig, like a branch or something?
No, but like a kissing scene, like between the lead and a love interest.
Well, unfortunately, the hero's time with the Collector is cut short, as we're showing a brief example of how powerful the Power Stone, this purple space gem is, Infinity Gem is. And it's here that we learn that Drax has called Ronan and Nebula to come and finally face him. And it's this now battle scene, I guess, in nowhere. And, you know, it's a good scene, right? There's a lot of action. But I believe two kind of, not many scenes, but two interactions within this scene really stand out. The first one I would like to mention is Ronan versus Drax. What did you think of their encounter?
I've always thought that fight was kind of lackluster.
Yeah.
I think it's Ronan's costume, really.
I think it could have been a really cool fight scene, and you could have still done it really well with Ronan destroying Drax, but it's this kind of slow, not really hyped up scene that just, it doesn't work for me.
Yeah, I think it's the costume's restrictive for Ronan to move in. I think that's the ultimate problem with this. Because it just, you're right, it's slow and it's weird. It doesn't feel quite right.
Well, and in the comics, Ronan jumps around, he's swinging his hammer, he is BA, and here, he's always on his feet, he's lumbering, he looks powerful, but he looks slow. And
he's stiff, too.
Yes, very stiff. The second interaction I would like to point out is between Peter and Gamora and Peter's sacrifice. What did you think of that?
I thought that this was actually very touching. Gamora's out there floating, and he's going to give himself up to go save her. And, you know, up until this point, he hasn't seemed that much concerned about other people. He did save Gamora earlier in the film, but only because he needed her for something. And so this seems like the first time he's compassionate towards another person, like really compassionate, and I liked it. So during this fight, Ronan is able to retrieve the orb, and he takes it back to the Dark Aster, his ship. And there's a couple things that happen here. One of the things we get is a line that says Thanos is the most powerful being in the universe, which I found interesting because in the comics, he is not, unless he has the Infinity Gauntlet, which he does not at this point. So it's interesting they're trying to set that up, especially because they don't show us that he is at all. The other thing in this scene that I have a question about, Zach, is when he's talking about Thanos being the most powerful, he's saying that because only the most powerful beings can handle the stones. The Collector says something very similar. However, Ronan takes it and is able to wield it. How?
As I said, Ronan is incredibly powerful. He is one of the cosmic super villains. I wouldn't say he's on the same power level as Thanos, but he's pretty close.
Okay. And I mean, I was kind of wondering because when he grabs it, he looks like he's kind of being torn apart, but then he puts it in the hammer. So I was also wondering maybe he uses the hammer as like a containment vessel, like the orb was, to channel the energy. So if someone else picked up the hammer, would they be able to use it? Would they explode? I don't know. I thought it was a little vague.
Well, no, I would agree. I don't believe that Ronan could have held the gem for eternity, but he does put it in his hammer, which I think kind of contains the energy, just like the gauntlet would.
Okay, cool. So the last thing I have questions about here, Zach, is Thanos himself. We've seen in this movie, we've seen in the Avengers, that he has sent other people off to collect the stones. Why is he doing this? Why doesn't he just get up and do it himself? Because it doesn't seem like it's working very well for him so far.
You know, that's a good question why he isn't collecting, because that is something he would have done himself. But for some unknown reason, Kevin Feige, he is not.
Okay. I guess that's as good an answer as any.
So we have Yondu and the Ravengers who have picked up all the heroes. Well, they picked up Peter Quill as well as Gamora until Rocket, Groot, and Drax are there to save them by blowing up the ship and killing everyone. And thus saving them. That was pretty funny. But in a roundabout way, they all got on board. They convinced Yondu to help them save Xandar and defeat Ronan. And it's here that we actually get an Easter egg from the Avengers. So as our team is together, they're talking, and Peter Quill says something to the fact of, I have a plan, and Rocket Raccoon's like, what's the percentage of the plan? And Peter Quill says 12%. Or, whatever. I can't remember who says 12.
Yeah, 12.
Yeah, right? Well, that is a callback, if you remember, to the Avengers, where Tony Stark tells Pepper to give herself 12% of, I can't believe...
The credit.
It's the credit, right?
Yeah, 12% of the credit.
And she's like, I was only having 12% of the moment, right? So this is actually a callback to that scene in the movie.
Yeah, I didn't catch that viewing it, but I did see that afterwards. It is really funny. There is an improvised line in here when they're all standing up. Rocket stands up. He's like, all right, we're all standing up now. We're all standing in a circle. That line was actually improvised by Sean Gunn on set while he was standing in for Rocket. And they liked it so much that they kept it in.
Yeah, I love that.
So we quickly go from here, travel through space, back to Xandar. And we have a very climactic battle scene here.
Now, in this battle scene, we get a Nova Corps blockade. This is something that I'm not really familiar with. I don't think it's in the comics. What did you think of that?
I thought it was really cool looking and awesome. It's definitely not from the comics. James Gunn talked about he was trying to come up with a new interesting visual that they could do to stop him. And so they came up with like this net thing. I'm not sure how practical it is to actually use. As we see, it doesn't work. I mean, they're trying to block a ship that's 1,000, 2,000 times larger than they are. But I think visually it looks really, really cool, and I really liked it.
And visually, after seeing how well everything was crafted, I really wish they would have used the Nova Corps for this, because that would have been an amazing fight scene. However, I understand that would have taken away from the Guardians of the Galaxy, which is the main focus of this movie.
Well, what do you mean, use the Nova Corps? Because, I mean, they're here.
Sure, I mean specifically their comic book versions. Them flying around, blasting, like in the air, in space, rather than just in a ship.
Yeah, I gotcha.
But it's here we get the Guardians who finally are able to make their way onto the ship. Yondu was supposed to go with them. He gets shot down and crash lands. And I believe all the Guardians are on the ship except Rocket Raccoon, who is kind of leading the Ravengers in helping the Xandarians defeat the enemies in the ships.
And so there is a moment in here where Peter has the gun that Rocket was going to use to blow up Yondu's ship, and he fires it at Ronan, who's attacking them. And Zach, in this moment, they play Star Wars music, which is the music that is playing while Luke is going down the trench. It's that dun dun dun.
Yeah.
Dun 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 Yeah, they used it here purposely, and I think it fits so well, as well as it just being a fun Easter egg.
And that's funny you mention that, because the feel of this movie is Star Wars. I mean, yes, it's an intergalactic movie. Yes, it's more humorous than Star Wars, but I don't know about you, Caleb. I really got the feeling of a Star Wars-esque movie.
Yeah, I mean, it has its own distinct vibe, you're right, but it does feel special like Star Wars, and I think that's maybe what you're talking about. A special movie, it is set in space, so it's easy to see how it's similar, and I don't think it hits the highs that Star Wars hits overall, but I can tell you what, it does not hit the lows.
That is correct. There is no Jar Jar Binks in Guardians of the Galaxy. Now,
yeah, as you stated, she's in Thor.
And her name's Darcy. Actually, we also do get a Natalie Portman, so Thor does hit the lows. Now, it's here that we also get another, I thought, pretty cool fight scene between Nebula and Gamora. Now, this is the second time they have actually met. We don't get to see the first time, as previously mentioned, because that was cut from the movie. So in the movie itself, without the deleted scenes, this is actually the first time that they meet, that we see it. But it's the second time.
Yeah, the first time we see them meet, not the first time they've ever met. They grew up together. But Zach, during this fight scene, Nebula says something that I found really interesting and hadn't noticed before, specifically because of the upcoming Infinity War movie. She states that of all of our siblings, she liked Gamora the most. And that's something to note, because in Infinity War,
she hated her the least.
Oh, okay. Hated her the least,
Very different.
liked her the most. Same thing. But and in the Infinity War movie, we're going to get the Black Order, which in the film version is Thanos' children, right? There's 4 of them. And the comics, they're not his children. They do work for him. But I thought it was interesting here because I didn't realize Thanos had other children, but it was set up here, in Guardians 4 years ago.
Yeah, in the comics, he has his family tree is very different.
Yes.
But as you mentioned, yeah, you're right. It is set up here. That scene you talked about, Caleb, it's actually technically back at the Unknown when Gamora's ship explodes. But you're right, that line does set up what we get in this Infinity War movie. So Yondu at this point has crash landed, and he is surrounded. And it's here that we get to see some of his power level. And he dismantles and kills everyone around him. There has to be like 20 people so fast.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's brutal, but it's cool.
Now, I thought it's also here in this final battle scene that we get some of the coolest fight scenes with Drax, Star-Lord, and Groot, who are all on ship and who are taking down the enemies to get to Ronan, the Accuser.
And this does all come to a head as they kind of blow up the ship when Rocket crashes into it, and it starts falling through the sky, and they're all going to die because they don't have a way off. And Groot decides that he is going to protect them and surround them with like this ball of wood. They're basically inside of it. It's hollow. And it's a very, very emotional scene. And Zach, you talked about how you hated some of the other deaths and you felt like Coulson was the best. I think this beats Coulson.
Caleb, the most emotional lines in the whole film are "We are Groot."
I know. Oh, it's so good. It's so powerful. And I mentioned in our earlier podcasts that I'm getting tired of the fake deaths. I mean, at this point, we'd had Bucky, Pepper, Loki, and Nick Fury. This one, I don't mind it at all. It feels sincere. It feels real. And, it actually has lasting consequences. Yes, he does come back, and he is in the sequel, but he's a kid. He's a baby. He's going to be like a teenager in Infinity War, so it has lasting consequences, so I can go for it more and don't have as many issues with it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Best death so far, Groot. And Kale, this is a good moment to point out that we haven't mentioned Vin Diesel actually had to record was it like 1,400 times of him saying, I am Groot? It was like this insane number of times. I can't remember the exact number.
Yeah, it was over 1,000, and he actually recorded it in other languages as well.
That's insane. Now, Caleb, you enjoyed Groot's death, or you thought it was a good death. But what did you think about this end scene? Because we think that Ronan might be dead. He's been hit by a gun. Then a plane was crashed into him, and then his plane crashed, right? Or his ship crashed, mm-hmm. and so he suffered a lot of damage. And yet he crawls out of the wreckage and is about to destroy everybody there until Peter Quill starts dancing.
Hey, Zach, do you see that? Do you see that over there? Way over there? Out in left field?
Yep.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where this came from. No, I mean, it was weird. It came out of left field, like I said, but it's fine. It's funny. Definitely funny. Do you think it's funny?
Yeah, it bothered me the first time I saw it. Like, I thought it was a funny scene, but I'm like, this is dumb. Watching it this time, it didn't bother me so much because I think it fits within the movie. It fits, the spirit of the movie.
Yeah. And, something I just thought of is, you said he crawls out of the wreckage, Ronan. That made me think of Malekith back in Thor the Dark World. I complained that the thing falling on him should not have killed him. Here, they literally fall out of the sky onto the earth, and it doesn't really fall on him, but he should have just as easily been dead, and he's not. Maybe Malekith isn't dead after all.
Well, the ship that fell on Malekith had a sharp edge like an axe, so it's presumed that it chopped him in two.
Details. There's actually a deleted scene here, Zach, when the dance-off starts. Thanos starts dancing. Thanos, not Thanos. Ronan starts dancing as well.
Oh, that's awesome. So in a roundabout way in this fight scene, Peter Quill is able to hold the stone, right? And basically wrestle it away from Ronan. However, he doesn't die right away, and then the rest of the Guardians of the Galaxy start holding hands. Now, something this movie has done really well up to this point that they did a lot throughout the movie is that I thought they explained everything to the point where it wasn't over-explaining, but it helped you as the viewer, like, get to the, okay, like, I'm familiar with this, I get it now, right? So, for example, The Collector showed you how, in the past, there have been a group of people that were able to contain the stone's energy for a time, and then they did that. And they've done this a couple times also throughout the movie, and here they do it again. I love how this movie is clearly explained and all the details are explained, and it pays off really well in this end scene.
That's just good writing. You usually don't want to bring something like this out of nowhere because it's a Deus Ex Machina. Like, people don't like that. It doesn't make sense. So you want to set it up in some way. And I think a lot of this can be credited to James Gunn. I think we actually forgot to mention this up top, but the script was originally written by someone named Nicole Perlman, who worked on it for about 2 years. But Gunn came in, said it didn't work, and he rewrote the entire thing. So even though she, I believe, has a credit for this.
Correct.
James Gunn actually did most of the heavy lifting here.
After containing the power of the stone and tricking Yondu in believing he has this stone, they set off to do a little bit of good, a little bit of bad, well, a little bit of both.
But not before Peter finds out that he's not all human, leaving a juicy tidbit for the sequel.
That's right. So we have a mystery. We don't know who Peter's dad is, and we also know that Peter isn't entirely human.
I just said that, Zach, but you are completely right.
And we end with Peter Quill opening up the box that his mom gave him with an awesome mixtape, Volume 2. And as that starts playing, the Guardians of the Galaxy, who, by the way, they named themselves. Well, they didn't name themselves, but
Ronan names them.
Ronan names them, but Peter Quill states their name, and they ride off to our 2 end credit scenes. So the first end credit scene we get is a funny dancing baby Groot.
Yeah, so apparently this was always intended to be in the film, but it was, I don't think, intended to be here. It might have moved around. I think it was at the end originally, and they bumped it up because it tested so well with audiences, and so they wanted everybody to be able to see it. And also, interestingly, the end credits stinger that was in the last movie, Winter Soldier, was originally supposed to be at the end of this film.
Really?
Yeah. Strange, right?
But I do remember that when the dancing baby Groot became a thing, that so many toys, shirts, memes, pictures, videos, etc., everybody was about the dancing baby Groot.
Well, I mean, kind of. Like, everybody was about it, but they didn't have any merchandise for it because they didn't expect it to blow up. Because I remember when it happened, all Courtney wanted was a dancing Groot. You couldn't buy it anywhere. There was nothing. They did ultimately come out with one, but it was like 6 months later or something, at least. We do have one now, though.
A little too late.
Yeah.
What is funny is in the credits at the end, they state that no raccoons or tree creatures were harmed in the making of this film.
I did notice that, which they have to put there legally, but funny.
Now, what is the other end credit scene we get, Caleb?
Well, Zach, as I mentioned, the collector has an interesting question. No, I want to...
No, that was actually funny. I like that.
Howard the Duck is in the Collector's Museum, and so at the end, with the entire thing destroyed because there was that explosion, we see the Collector sitting there, and Howard the Duck is there.
That's right.
Now, something that is kind of weird and this was not planned, actually. Even when they were shooting it, this was not planned. It was a last-minute addition that they decided to do this. So I was kind of wondering, like, did they just have the shot of the blown up containment thing and they just put him in there, or did they rebuild it, or is that all CG? And they actually had to design Howard in one day because they had to get it to the animators to animate because this was such a late addition.
That would make sense because I didn't think he looked spectacular. I mean, he looked okay, but he didn't look spectacular by any means.
I don't think his design or the CGI looks great.
No, I mean, he is voiced by Seth Green. Caleb, I don't know if you remember this. My only encounter with Howard the Duck isn't in the comics. It's actually a comment by you. I believe we were visiting when we were younger, and you had told us that you were going to watch Howard the Duck, and that you turned it on, and in the first 2 minutes, there was a pretty raunchy fondue scene between maybe a couple of ducks, and you were like, I ain't watching this.
Oh, yes. I think you're referring to the bathtub. That there is a Howard the Duck movie that was made in the 80s by George Lucas, no less, and it is one of the biggest box office bombs of all time. That movie's just quackers.
I don't have a good duck pun. So, Caleb, that pretty much sums up the movie, and if my memory serves me correctly, this movie did phenomenal. So why don't you see if my memory is correct with letting us know the critical and commercial success of this movie?
Well, it was released August 4th of 2014 with a budget of $232 million. I read that this actually went over budget. They was supposed to be a bit lower, but maybe because they believed in James Gunn, they bumped it up. It did have a worldwide gross of $773 million, which is a 333% return, which is pretty good. Rotten Tomatoes currently has it sitting at a 91%, and Metacritic has it sitting at a 76%. This is one of the most loved MCU movies, even until now, 2018. People love this movie. It is the third highest grossing film in the MCU at the time of release, behind Avengers and Iron Man 3, both of which cracked $1 billion, so it's not surprising that this did not do that kind of money, and both of which, were sequels to other films. This was not. It was also the third highest grossing film of 2014, behind Transformers: Age of Extinction. Sigh. Which, side note, I think
terrible.
The first half of that movie's good. Second half's not.
After 4 hours, you're done with it.
Oh, it's so long. after that movie, and also The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, which I believe was the final Hobbit movie. Thank goodness. And it was nominated for 51 awards. 51 awards, Zach. I think that's the most of any of these films that it was nominated for. And it won 15 of them, including Best Actor for Chris Pratt, Best Makeup, and Best Ensemble.
That is incredibly impressive.
Yeah, this movie did very, very well for itself.
Well, not only did this movie do well, but, I mean, it left a legacy. First off, it changed some of the comics. So I strongly believe that a lot of the comic in the Volume 2 Guardians of the Galaxy, as we've talked about, was taken for this movie. But they released a third volume, Caleb. It ran from 2013 to 2015, and then a fourth volume that's running from 2015 to now. And in these comics, they keep basically the cast. They retcon like Star-Lord to make him look a little more like Chris Pratt. They retcon, I believe, Drax as well to make him more like the movie version. And in this 2015 Volume 4 comic series, they've now retconned Yondu. So he is like the version that we get in Guardians of the Galaxy.
Oh, wow. Yeah, we didn't mention it, I don't think, but the Guardians are pretty accurate to their comic book versions, the main group in this movie. So there's not a whole lot to change, although Star-Lord doesn't wear a jumpsuit in this film. He does have the same helmet mostly, but he doesn't have the top of it, which kind of looks like a Spanish helmet. But the rest of them are very similar, so it's easier to change things for this movie than it would be for some other movies. Yondu is interesting because I'm pretty sure he is separated by a lot of time in the comics, like 1,000 years or something. So I guess they did some kind of time travel to get him in.
You know, they do a lot of time travel with a lot of these cosmic beings.
Yeah, so that makes sense. Other than that, Zach, I mean, this movie did prove that Marvel can make a film out of anything. I mean, look, if I said, oh, hey, Zach, I'm going to make a movie out of that rock, what do you think? It would not go well. And they did it with a tree. That's
right. Marvel is just dominating at this point. Well, I mean, and think about how much of an impact it had on just society, right? There was a cartoon that came out about it, a ton of merchandise, shirts, toys, like fake weapons or whatever. They made a video game, a Telltale series about Guardians of the Galaxy. So Telltale, yep. So, I mean, it's really impacted this culture.
Yeah, it has permeated the culture in a way that few other films have, especially considering how new it is.
This has also set us up for the Infinity War movie, though.
Yes, so it pretty much gave us a better idea of what the stones are, the Infinity Stones, and also gave us a good introduction to Thanos. Real quick, I wanted to recap the stones we have so far and where they are. So we have the Tesseract, which is the Space Stone. That's on Asgard. We have the Ether, which is the Reality Stone. That's in the Collector's Museum, which is a bit busted now. And we have the Orb from this movie, which is the Power Stone, which we see at the end is left with the Nova Core. So that's 3 out of the 6 stones that we need for the upcoming Infinity War film.
And so we just need 3 more.
And so as I did mention before, this movie did so well. James Gunn does go on to do the sequel, and he is going on to plan Phase 4, and also direct Volume 3, which I believe will make him the first director to direct the whole trilogy for an MCU franchise.
Hey, there has to be a first, even at Marvel.
Marvel has tons of firsts. But yeah, I mean, Zach, major impact on society, as you said.
And a just fantastic movie all around.
Well, in that regard, Zach, what did you think of this movie? Where is it in your rankings?
I thought it was great, but Caleb, you know that I always do my rankings second, so please enlighten us.
All right. Well, I'm going to level with you guys. All last week, I was in Disney World. So I was very busy and very tired, and I watched this the day we got back after I had been driving for several hours. So, I think that might have affected my enjoyment of this film, just a little bit. Is this film good? Yes. Yes, this is definitely good. This is a great film. There's no probably about it. This is a great film. It's beautiful in its color. The designs of everything is phenomenal. It seems like they really took the time to figure things out, which, I mean, I actually know they did, because James Gunn has talked about how much background knowledge they made that's not even in the movie for, like, the different races and things like that. The music selection is phenomenal. It's great. The score for this film, which isn't in it a whole lot, it's fine. Again, I thought it sounded a little bit like the Avengers. It's a new composer to the MCU, so it's not. The acting is phenomenal. I was personally worried about Dave Bautista because he was a WWE guy coming into this. He is phenomenal. He is one of the funniest parts of this movie. Groot and Rocket, for the most part, look great. Early on, I think they were a little rocky, but I believe they're characters, and that's the most important thing, right? I believe they're standing there, I believe they're talking, and influencing the things around them. James Gunn has done a great job pulling this together. Now, I didn't enjoy it as much this time as I have previously. Part of that is, after seeing Volume 2, this feels a little quaint. The first time I saw it, I felt that this really felt open and immersive, and it opened the world. But it's just, I don't know what it was this time. I'm going to assume it was because I was tired. I was exhausted. And so I just wasn't really into watching the film. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it is good. No, it's not as crazy as Volume 2. Sequels are always going to be bigger because you don't have to introduce as many things. But still good. I do think, though, the second half is a bit better. James Gunn talked about in some behind-the-scenes stuff that you want to get to the team, you want them to come together, because that's what the movie's for. I agree. The first half where they're not together, less fun. Not as great. It felt more like a slog. But mostly pleasant slog. So, my rankings last week were, starting with number 1, going to number 9. I'm not going to say the numbers every time because it's getting confusing at this point, Zach. But I had Captain America, the Winter Soldier, The Avengers, Iron Man, Thor the Dark World, Captain America, the First Avenger, The Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 3, and Iron Man 2. So where is this in my rankings? I know straight up at the top, it's in the top 3 or 4. And so I go to my list, I look at the top 3, I see Captain America, Winter Soldier, The Avengers, and Iron Man. And I was wondering where exactly to put this. In my head, I was like, you know what? I'm going to put this directly below Iron Man, because that's how I felt about it on this viewing. And I just don't think that's fair. Really. I've seen this movie a few times, and I know that I enjoy it better than that. So the question becomes, is it better than The Avengers? Good question. Avengers was a landmark. This movie, not quite so landmark. Because it's the first one, right? It introduces a ton of characters. It does a phenomenal job with that. Which one would I like to see more? I don't know. Based on my watching this time, I think I would rather see Avengers more. So it's kind of tied with Avengers, I think. So I'm going to put it today at... You know what? I'll go number 2 with it.
Oh,
I will put it above Avengers.
Wow.
Now, I don't want to keep saying every time it could switch, but really, my feelings on these Marvel movies are, there's groupings, right? It's not quite as much, this one's number 1, this one's number 2. It's, these are the 5 that are the best. These are the 5 that are the next best. And so that's why I have issues with some of these ones towards the top. But for today, number 2, which brings my list, the exact same as it was, but the top changing to Captain America Winter Soldier, and number 2 being Guardians of the Galaxy. Zach, tell me how you felt about this film.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know if you'd rank it that high. So Guardians of the Galaxy, for me, is a fantastic movie. I had known some of the characters as mentioned, but I had no idea what to think going into this movie. This is one of those movies that I just wanted to continue to watch again and again and again. It had me laughing through the entire movie. Unlike yourself, I thought the CGI here was pretty much flawless on Groot and Rocket. The humor is my type of humor, so it was spot on. The character development with all of them was really good. Yeah, I thought the villain here was a little lame. I really wish they would have shown more action and his power level, but I can go past that because I feel like the development of the heroes was so important and was done in such a great way. I mean, there's nothing else I can really say about this movie. The soundtrack is phenomenal. It's a great listen to. I was listening to the soundtrack after this movie just because it's iconic, right? And they do a lot of great things with this movie that honestly, I don't think they necessarily are able to duplicate in the second installment of Guardians of the Galaxy. And so this original one is one that has a special place in my heart. I just watched this a couple days ago, but I would get off our podcast and go watch it again because I love it that much. So my old list was Captain America, the Winter Soldier, Avengers, Iron Man is 3, Captain America is 4, Thor 2 is my 5, Thor 1 is my 6, Iron Man 2 is my 7, The Incredible Hulk is my 8, and finally, Iron Man 3 at the bottom of my list as 9. So where does Guardians of the Galaxy fall on that list? As you mentioned, Caleb, it is in my top 3. And so I looked at the list, Captain America, Winter Soldier, Avengers, and Iron Man. Where does it fall? Caleb, it is better than Iron Man, I thought, just with the humor, the way it's shot, and the composition of the characters. However, unlike yourself, I still rank Avengers above Guardians of the Galaxy just because of how iconic it was to bring all those individual superheroes together versus starting out with your own cast to develop. I think the Guardians of the Galaxy had a harder job doing it. I think in some parts and some respects they did a better job at it. But on the other hand, I just loved the enemy in the Avengers, the drive towards that. And it's a different style of movie. It's funny, but it's not necessarily comedy, which Guardians of the Galaxy is. Which means I will place Guardians of the Galaxy as my number 3, making my top 3 movies so far Captain America the Winter Soldier, The Avengers, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 as my 3rd spot.
Well, Zach, we diverged for a bit, but we seem to be coming closer and closer with these other movies. And I think that really goes back to what I was saying, how these movies are more groups rather than straight rankings.
And I would have to agree with you there. Which brings us to another loser. Well, he's actually pretty cool. Taylor Poole.
Taylor Poole did our opening music, and we think he's pretty awesome. You know what? I've known Taylor for a couple years, and he will take care of you whatever you need. So you can find him at taylorpoolemusic.com. That's TaylorPoole music.com.
And in between our podcasts, if you like magic or video games, go ahead and jump on over to CNC Power Hour. That's C, the letter N, C, Power Hour. They stream magic on Sundays and video games throughout the week.
On Twitch.
Thanks for listening to 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Guardians of the Galaxy. We would love to hear your comments or feedback at cuzwerenerds@gmail.com. That's CUZWERENERDS@gmail.com. Or leave us a review or rating on iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or any other major social networking or podcasting site. Join us next week as the Avengers reassemble in The Avengers: Age of Ultron. How does Marvel adapt an iconic robotic supervillain? Why does this movie introduce a few new heroes but leave out others? And is this movie as good as the first installment? Find out these answers and much more on 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Avengers: Age of Ultron. Stay nerdy.
Did Zach take like a 2-minute break to make me a latte?
Nope.
Probably not.
It's actually more of a 10-minute. I need to get on this, but such is life.
I'll just have to be extra loud today. today.
No! Make the latte!
Yeah.